Hello everyone. We're just going to wait for people to join the webinar. It's going to take a couple of seconds and then we'll start in about 30 seconds. So you can see the number of participants is going up, which is great. Thanks for coming. Hello and welcome if you're starting to join. Today, we're having some technical issues with Rachel's Wi-Fi, so hopefully that will be sorted soon and she'll be able to join us. But thanks for everyone who's joined us so far. It's great to have you here. Thanks for choosing to be here with us on Friday morning. I hope you're all well. So I think it's a good time to start. I think everyone has joined us. If not, they will catch up in a second. So hello and welcome. My name is Dasha Zhurauskaya, and I'm one of the presenters today. My colleague Rachel is having some technical issues. She's trying to connect, but hopefully she'll join us later. So as I said, thank you and welcome. If you have any questions at any point, please post your questions throughout this talk in the Q&A section. I haven't done any webinars and it feels really weird talking to my screen, but it would be great if you connect and just post in the Q&A so that it's more engaging. So it's not just me talking, but I'm responding to some of your questions as well. And there will be live captioning on this talk. It's automated, so it might not be really accurate, but hopefully it will help someone who needs it. So I'm going to just share my screen with you. So welcome to this talk on recreating York's hidden stories, and I'm sharing our website, which is called yorkhiddenstories.org, which is about eliciting, recording, transcribing and analysing interviews, in our case interviews that were conducted as part with York residents, which I'm going to talk to you about in a moment. So just quickly, I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Dasha. I'm local in York. I'm also local in a small city of Svetlogorsk, which is in Belarus. I've lived in York for almost 15 years. I studied BA degree in English language and linguistics, and graduated with a master's by research from the University of Leeds. I'm also one of the co-authors of York Hidden Stories, Interviews in Applied Linguistics book, which I'm going to show you today. I'm going to tell you about our project a little bit. Hopefully my colleague Rachel will be able to join us at some point and introduce herself as well. But Rachel is the head of School of Psychology, Languages and Linguistics and Education at York St John University. The structure of our talk today was slightly different. I didn't anticipate Rachel not being here, so I'll try to cover her points as well. But what we're going to talk about today is interviews with the migrant population of York, and I'm going to give you some background information about a community project that was running in York, about our project and involvement in this community project, and then Rachel was going to talk about the research questions, but I'll cover that as well. So we had two research questions that were addressed with two different analyses. Then I'm going to briefly sort of talk to you about some theories or different ways of thinking of interviews. But before I go into my talk, I wanted to ask you a question, and please respond in the Q&A. It would be great, of what experiences, if any, you've had with interviews, and what do you think of interviews, and mainly the question of why interview? What do interviews mean? Why do we use them, and why are they so popular, and in both research but also in everyday life? Because I think we don't even need to sort of explain what interviews mean, because everyone knows what it is, but it would be great if you can share those answers as to why interview and what you think of interviews in the Q&A section. And I'll try and monitor the Q&A and respond to you as we go along. So I'll start with the background information. I'll just jump into another section of our website. So the website was created to help students and researchers who use interviews. So it has information from Rachel and me in black on white, but it also has some information white on green, which is extracts that were taken from our book. So the background to our project, it all started with research commissioned by Joseph Roundtree's foundation, Your Grants Committee, in 2010, and it was conducted by Gary Craig, who I think has joined us today, which is great. So the research looked at mapping. I'm just going to show you the report. So the Craig's et al. Research looked at mapping the changing minority ethnic population of York, and the results were great. So they found that York had residents from 92 different ethnic origins, and there were 68 minority first languages spoken in the city, which is fantastic. And so York is always seen as, well, it's mostly seen as white middle class, but what Craig's research highlighted is that there is, they estimated that around 11% of the population of York was from different ethnic backgrounds. And so the recommendation of this research was that the city, the universities, we as residents needs to strengthen our commitment to racial equality and diversity, and celebrate and make people welcome and feeling proud of living in York. So the community project that Rachel and I got involved with was conducted by a centre that was based at York St John University at that time, and the centre worked with 15 people from York Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds. Those people lived in York for 2 to 50 years at that time. They came from Africa, Asia, Latin America, Central America and Europe. And so the community project involved this group of people in a series of workshops and meetings, and the idea was that people connected, and then they were sort of trained to tell their stories. And the outcome of, not outcome, but the final stage of this project was that those participants were asked to take part in 1 hour long semi-structured interviews. So semi-structured means that there was a set of questions. I'm just going to scroll to show you those questions. So there were different questions asking about people's backgrounds, why they came to York, what they liked and disliked about living in York, what was it like for them moving here, how did the city sort of welcome them. So there were about 26 questions, but it wasn't all set to those questions. So the project participants sort of used others as they went along in their interviews. So Rachel and I got involved at the final stage when the interviews were already conducted, and we came as applied linguists, and we're given this great opportunity to look and analyze at, those interviews. So I'm just going to scroll through to show you. So this were the 15 participants and their place of origin, and the length of their interviews was recorded. So as I said before, this text, white on green, is the extracts that were taken from the York Hidden Stories book that Rachel and I published. So I'm just going to check if Rachel was able to join us. I don't think so, so I'll just sort of carry on talking. So when we joined the project, we had those interviews, and we looked at those interviews from two different perspectives. So first one was project leaders of the York Hidden Stories project. We refer to them in our book as the client, or the went techniques of a client, but they were it was a partnership. So they wanted to look at the interviews and analyze different themes. In particular, they wanted to look at reasons why people came to York, the values that they shared, and the barriers that they faced when they came to York. And so that was research question one: what themes occurred in interviews with the York Black, Asian, minority ethnic residents on those three topics: reasons, values, and barriers. And then the second question that we addressed was from the perspective of applied linguistics, and applied linguistics looks at language-related problems in real world. So as applied linguists, we looked at the interviews and we asked ourselves the question of how do the interviewers contribute and shape the interaction with the interviewees within those interviews. So I'm going to cover Rachel's part, which was to look at themes. And to look at themes, we used an approach called thematic analysis. And we skimmed through the interviews, and we used a sort of a top-down approach of looking at the themes the three themes that I mentioned that were identified by the project leaders, and looked at the interviews and classified them that way. So so some of the reasons of why people came to York were really obvious. They came here for studying, to work, to join family members. Some were refugees. The values that people shared were also common values, like the people said that they treasured and valued their families, their religion, their education, and then barriers that people faced were things like mainly racism, so those were the results that of the thematic analysis that we then shared with the project leaders. But as applied linguists, we were more interested in looking at those interviews from a perspective of how did those interviews get constructed, how did the stories that people were sharing were co-created within that hour. What does that mean, doing this interview? What do the stories mean? Were they only told within that hour, or do the stories have an application outside of that interview? So we used an approach called conversation analysis, and conversation analysis is also referred as CA, is an approach that is used to studying social interactions in real life. And the main principle of it is turn taking. So this turn taking system of one party speaking at a time, and then another after the other. So it's basically talk, as believed by conversation analysts, is organized into turns. And so we took the interviews and we looked at the turn taking. And obviously interviews are a very interesting example of turn taking, because there is preconceived sort of structure to them of questions and answers by the interviewers and interviewees. So it was interesting to see how the answers were constructed in a view of the questions. So to do the conversation analysis, we started with the recordings, and then what conversation analysts do is they use transcription. So I'm just going to share another slide with you to give you an example of what conversation analysis transcription might look like. So this is an example from Charles Antaki's tutorial on how to do conversation analysis. And on the left-hand side, you can see Sarah and Lynn talking in turns. So you see the turns numbered, then you see the names, and then the words. So this is a word for word transcription. So mom, hello, I'm here. Okay, hello, hi. And then it carries on. And on the right-hand side, you can see some symbols which you might not have seen before, or you have. So things like off camera. So this is additional information that's added by a conversation analyst. And then mom with an emphasis, and then hello with an out breath, and then there is a pause. So conversation analysts listen to the transcription, to the recording many times, and then we try to capture verbal and non-verbal elements in talk, which might be, which are always useful when doing the analysis. So this is just an example of what I'm going to show you in a moment. So we use this conversation analytic approach, and I'm going to share one of the examples. You can see the symbols that were used. So things like laughter is really important, or pauses. There might be micro pauses, or some pauses are timed, which also can give great amount of information later on. So I'm going to show you this extract too that came from our data. And this extract came from the beginning of an interview, and there was some talk prior to this extract, but this extract begins with an interviewer asking a question. And I'm going to focus on the first 7 lines of it. So I'm just going to quickly sort of read it out with as much detail as I can. So the interviewer starts with asking a question in line 1. Is there anything in particular that you really do treasure about the country of origin? Any particular? Anything, you know, it could be food, music, people. Yes, I love the music. So I've just read it out, and I'm going to sort of explain to you what it all means. So here in line 1, we see a question, and the interviewer is starting with asking anything. Can you share anything? But then after a small pause, the emphasis goes on in particular. Is there anything in particular that you really treasure about the country of origin? And then at line 3, we can see a timed pause, and it's a great place for the interviewee to start giving the answer. But as we can see in line 4, the interviewee problematizes and questions, seeks clarification in any particular. So we can see that the emphasis was put on in particular, and that gets picked up in line 4 by any particular. And then what's interesting to note is that the interviewer then goes on to say anything, and then the micro pause here in line 5 is a great sort of transition place where the interviewee could have jumped in and responded to the question. However, the interviewee is silent, and then the interviewer continues with a list of possible suggestions for the answer. So the interviewer lists food, music, people, and you can see an overlap in people, and then the interviewee said yes. And so at that point, she's peeking at line 7, we can see that they've picked the word music from the list offered in line 5. So, and then the interviewee goes on and expands on that later on. So what we can see here is that if we were to do the thematic analysis, we would choose the word music as our theme for treasure. What do people say that they treasure? But by closely looking at the way that this extract was constructed, we can see how this theme was generated, and it was picked from a suggestion of from a list. So whereas some research has in, for example, focus groups has shown that providing a list of suggestions might be a beneficial thing, because you're giving the respondents more time to think, or you're giving them different options to respond. Some might argue that it has a constraining effect on the answer, because the answer is not the one that came from a person. The answer was linguistically constructed from prior talk. So I'm just going to quickly look at the questions and see if there is anything relevant. Thank you for posting your questions. So I'll give you some time to sort of read till the end of the this extract whilst I look at the questions. Oh, great. So there is people saying that they've had an experience of job interviews. There's a professional engineer who used interviews. Great. So they, someone is saying that interviews is not a very accurate, successful way of distinguishing between good and poor candidates. Yeah, that's for job interviews. Great. Admissions interviews. Great. So since Rachel is not here, so it's a bit harder for me to actually properly respond to the questions and carry on talking, so that you don't feel like I've paused for too long. Just going to get back to the extract and sort of highlight other things that were interesting in it. So, for example, I'm going to start in line 10, and here it's highlighted. Hopefully you can see it. So the interviewee then carries on and says that they miss that music, and when they play it in the car, the children don't like it, and then there is laughter, and they say, "Oh, parent, put English one on," and then laughter again. And this is an interesting example of what's called direct reported speech, and the research has shown that people use direct reported speech in their talk to sort of give evidence or support to the statements that they previously made. So it's a really clever technique that this interviewee has used to give more detail and to sort of be more descriptive of their story that they were sharing with their interviewer. Sorry. So so that is this conversation analysis, and we've had a number of those extracts that we looked at and that we talk about more in the book and on the website. And so the result of the conversation analysis was that we were able to make a set of recommendations. I'm just going to scroll through to them. So the recommendations that we made were based on, oh, sorry, I'm just going to respond to one of the questions that I know. Does the book cover transcripts of the interviews or just the linguistic analysis? So it doesn't go into much details about transcription, but it does have information about how to transcribe and the different symbols to use in different types of transcriptions and the amount of details that's needed, but it has several extracts in the book, and then the linguistic analysis follows each extract. And so after each analysis, we have a set of recommendations. So I'm just going to enlarge it a bit. So I'm going to jump into the recommendations again. There you go. So the recommendation, I'm just going to go through the 5 recommendations that we published on the website. And one was, so if an interviewer notices that their question sort of broaden the scope of the original questions, or they've made a specific contribution, such as the one I've showed in the extracts, like offering another word or a range of choices, they could follow that up with a more generic contribution. For example, is there something else that you would want to say, or do you have some more comments about this topic? And what's interesting here is the use of some versus any. So the research into doctor-patient interactions is showing that by using something, would you like to say something else, is more likely to generate a further response or a more detailed response, as opposed to any, which has a more negative connotation. So if you say to someone, is there anything else that you would like to say, you are less likely to get a follow-up response. So that was recommendation 1. So recommendation 2 is, so if the interviewer notices that the interviewee questioned or problematized the original question, like for example, with the extract, the interviewee said any particular, so they were seeking a clarification of what any particular means. And interviewer can consider to just say, be very generic and say, replying yes or anything. Actually, it should be something. And interviewer kind of could try to avoid adding more information, but just restating keeping it generic to give the interviewee a chance to come up with their own answer or process the understanding of the question. So recommendation 3 was if an interviewer notices that their response to an interviewee's answer was overtly judgmental or seemed to sort of change the direction of the original question, they can just repeat the original questions slower with more pauses. Of course, that could result in the interviewees repeating their their answer, but sort of leaving it open for the interviewee to come up with their, give them the opportunity to sort of formulate and think through their answer. So recommendation 4 was about pauses, and pauses were really important because generally people feel uncomfortable with longer pauses or silences. So at the beginning of interviews, it's a good practice to set some ground rules to say that there are going to be pauses after, longer pauses after questions, and pauses are okay. Hope you feel comfortable with them, and it's giving you time to think. So so pauses can potentially lead to more interesting and detailed answers. So pauses, longer pauses are great. So in recommendation 5 was, and if the interviewer feels that the answer was insufficient, they could have asked to say, is there something else that you would want to say about this topic? But also accept that there might not be a more detailed answer or further response, and that's okay too. So those recommendations are not prescriptive. They're just they were the outcomes of the analysis that we've conducted, and they're just the types of noticings that we wanted to highlight for the interviewers to practice. So interviewing is a craft, and the only way to get better at it is by practicing it, but also noticing the questions that you ask, and most importantly, the types of what responses you generate. And the only way to do it is just to record yourself, try and do some transcription, add as many details as you feel comfortable, and then really listen to the recording and try and notice things that were highlighted in the recommendations. So that was a bit about transcription and conversation analysis and the recommendations that we've made in the book. So one thing that I'm just going to check if, I don't think Rachel will be joining us, unfortunately. I'm just going to turn to another part which Rachel was to cover. And so on another note, wanted to say that this, the website that we've created, which is like a tutorial based on the book, and it guides researchers or community project leaders through this 4-step process of interview and reflection, and then transcription, and then another set of reflections with guided questions, and then we recommend that people try and do another interview based on the reflections that they've made from the first interviews, and then make the final reflections and recommendations in part 4. So I'm just going to turn to part 4. So this question of why do we interview? I'm just going to quickly browse through the questions and see if I can respond to some. So there is a therapist who I think, so they wrote, so the interviews are helpful to gather facts and also insights and opinions. So interviews, they've interviewed others for jobs, and success of the interview, they believe that the success of the interview is due to the interviewer rather than the interviewee. What I hopefully was able to show you through the extract is that the interviews are important for both interviewers and interviewees, because interviewees play an equal part in generating the stories throughout the interviews. And I think it's our sort of obligation as researchers and interviewers to make it explicit to the interviewees to say to them that their contributions are valuable. They're the same equal part to the interview as interviewees. So historically, maybe, or interviewers are seen as a sort of having more power within the interview situation, because they ask questions. They're the one who have the power to start or move on to the next question to wrap up the interview. But as the example with the music demonstrated, is that interviewees have the same sort of power. They're using different techniques, like they converse, using the direct reported speech, for example, to try and establish their power, to try and use those really clever linguistic techniques to add the details to contribute to the interview. So it's a joint collaboration. It's interviewers and interviewee are an equal part, and that's what the turn taking demonstrates. Hopefully that somehow answered the questions. And I'm just going to go through some more and see if I can answer anything else. So there's a question about, did anyone address the number of people that came to York from other areas of UK? I don't know the answer to this question, but it would be interesting to go back to this, the mapping report, but it would also be very interesting to see the results of the census that was conducted this year, and I hope that the number of the minority ethnic population has grown, and that will be highlighted in the results of the new census. So that doesn't really answer the question, but no. So admissions interview wrote that I've used interviews to really dig down into participant understanding. They give you a chance to ask additional questions and seek clarification. So there are different beliefs of what interviews are and why to interviews. So some of the theoretical beliefs are that, well, traditionally we think of interviews as digging down into participants' understanding, but what conversation analysis sort of also shows us with this co-construction, as I've mentioned before, of stories, of answers. So it's the answer can never be seen in isolation, because the answer is always dependent on what came in prior talk, what was the question, how did the question get clarified, and but you know, it's sort of, it's yeah, so it's not just black and white, it's always sort of grey. We can't just say that we can use interviews to dig into those people's sort of minds, or get a single story of their life, because from knowing that interviews are conversations, we know that they get co-constructed every time that interviewee retells their story. So, and that's the powerful part of seeing this detailed turn by turn like representation of interviews, is telling the interviewees that they are not given just the right answers at the right time. The answers will always be different, and the answers will always be constructed within the setting. And I think someone wrote in the questions that the answer will also be dependent on how we interact with both the interviewee, but also interviewers, but also with non-human sort of participants of the interview, the recording equipment, for example. The answers will are bound to be different. So, like, for example, with the transcript that I showed you, there was some additional information that was said off camera, and then as soon as you turn camera on, that, you know, the humans will interact with that recording equipment. That will influence the answer, that will change the answers, and as well as the surrounding of what the setting is. Some people believe that the background of relationship are important, so building rapport with your interviewees is important. But again, that might be downside in an interview, because the interviewee will frame their answers to fit with that prior knowledge that they have of the interviewer. So it's not, it's great to think about interviews as constructed in a moment, from the time, if you were recording, from the moment, you know, you enter this recording, or from the moment the interviewer enters the room. And I think it's our obligation as researchers to make it explicit to the interviewees that so that they're aware that of the situation, this recording equipment in the room, where the interview is going to go, what the answers are always going to be different, and that's okay. And that's the beauty of telling stories, that they are told differently every time that they are retold. And hopefully that empowers people. So I'm just going to go through some more questions. Oh, thank you. Yeah, sorry if I've jumped, sort of was a bit chaotic. I didn't expect Rachel not to be here, so I was trying to rethink of the structure of our talk, and what to cover and how to do it, and how hopefully it was all clear, and you took something out of it. So I agree, the equal input, but if the interviewer is not proficient, the interview will not be successful as an interview. Well, that's an interesting and fair comment to say, but we should always remember that each interaction is different, and it doesn't matter whether the interviewer or an interviewee, the proficiency doesn't matter, because it will be an experience which will have valuable and interesting information, and it depends on what angles you take and how you analyze. That's what really matters and what's important. Yeah, thank you. Yes, I was thrown a bit, Rachel not being here, but she's having connection difficulties, so it's out of our control, but thank you. I think I'm going to sort of wrap up. So I'm gonna stay with you for another 10 minutes, but I wanted to tell you, conclude with a story of it's not in here, so I'll stop scrolling because it's very confusing. But I wanted to conclude with telling a little bit about myself and where I come from. I come from Belarus, and hopefully you can see it on the map here. You might have heard of Belarus recently. It's been on the news a lot. It's been on the news because of the presidential elections that took place last August in 2020. And it all started with a blogger, Sergei Tikhanovsky, who was traveling around Belarus collecting stories of people. So he was interviewing people and sharing it on his blog. And unfortunately, the stories that he was telling, or that he was telling with the people he was interviewing, were not popular with the government. And he was jailed. He's still in jail. He's a political prisoner. And out of 450 that are currently in Belarus. And but fortunately, the stories that he was telling continued to be told by his wife, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and she is the leader of Democratic Belarus and is working really hard to raise awareness of the situation in Belarus, and so I've been obviously following her and watching her speeches at the different European Parliament meetings, and she starts every speech with pictures and stories of political prisoners, and I think it can be a really powerful way to connect with people by telling stories. So the stories, it's great that people are continuing to tell stories. And she's doing that, and I think it's also great to be listening to different stories to find out about other people, and but also know that those stories are always different depending on different contexts they're told, and how they're told, and why they're told as well. So I think I'm going to leave it there. So thank you for joining us, and just going to spend some more time just scrolling through the questions and see if I can answer any more. But hopefully you enjoyed this talk and took something out of it. And feel free to visit our website to find out more. And do get in touch with us via the contact form on the website. Just contact us at the bottom here. So I'm just going to go back to the questions and see if I can quickly answer or share some more. Oh, I think Gary Craig, thanks for joining. Hopefully you've found it interesting, and thanks for doing this really important work on mapping out the ethical the population of York. It was really interesting to find out. Yeah, so there was a question about providing expected answers. And what's interesting to note about the expected answers is it's, this prior knowledge that sometimes can, well, it always plays part. It cannot be, interviews cannot be seen in sort of isolation. It's always interlinked with the the research that we do prior to interviews and the actual interview as it happens. And the expected answers could also be generated by posing expected questions. So both questions and answers are important. Thank you. Thanks, Caroline. I think I'm going to end it here. Thanks for joining, and please do visit the website and get in touch if you have any further questions. And yes, thanks for being here with me. Sorry, Rachel couldn't join, but I hope I've covered everything and you were able to sort of engage and understand it. Thank you.